The county had been trying to give away the Marchand building for 9 years, and by that March, the whole business had turned into a joke people told at the counter of the Sunrise Cafe while they waited for their eggs. 9 years. Advertised twice a year in the Delft County Register in 6-point type under a heading that read surplus real property, sealed bid. And 9 years of nobody putting a single envelope in the box, not one. The county administrator had a running line about it that he used at Rotary and at the fair and once, unwisely, at a funeral lunch, which was that the Marchand building was the only thing in Aman that was free and still overpriced. Everybody laughed because everybody knew the number. The number was $214,000. That was what the engineering firm out of Columbus had put at the back of its report in 2019 under a heading called Recommended Disposition, and it was the estimate for demolition, asbestos abatement, sidewalk protection, and site clearance down to a gravel pad. $214,000 to make the corner of 3rd and Court into a parking lot. The report itself ran 91 pages. Almost nobody in town had read past the summary, but everybody in town knew the number, the way a town knows one number about a building and forgets everything else it ever was. The rest of the report said the 5th floor had a measurable sag along its center bay. It said the 2 elevator shafts were open at the top and taking water. It said there was regulated insulation on the steam lines in the basement and around the boiler breaching, and that the parapet on the Court Street face had displaced masonry that would eventually want taking down. It said the roof membrane was at the end of its service life and had been at the end of its service life for a long while. It did not say the building was falling down. Engineers rarely do. What they say is that they cannot certify, and that is a different sentence entirely, but in a town it gets repeated as though it were the same one. So the Marchand building stood on the square with plywood in its display windows and pigeon wire on its cornice, 5 stories of dark red brick with limestone banding and a corner entrance cut on the diagonal, and a name still cut into the stone above that entrance in letters 12 inches high. Marchand Bros. 1911. The letters had held up better than anything else. Limestone will do that. It will outlast the family, the business, the chain that bought the business, and the county that ended up holding the bag. The store had closed on a Saturday in January of 1981. There were people in Aman who still remembered the last day, the way the clerks stood at the ends of their counters with nothing to do because there was nothing left to sell. And how at 4 o'clock somebody had turned off the mezzanine lights first, which was the wrong order, and the ground floor had gone strange and shadowed for the last hour it was ever open. After that, it was a furniture liquidator for 2 years, then a flea market on weekends, then nothing. Then a Sunday morning fire in the building next door that never crossed the party wall but scared off the last tenant. Then the taxes stopped being paid in 2014, and in 2016 the county took it, the way counties do, without wanting it at all. The sale that March was the 18th advertisement. The clerk who ran it, a patient woman named Delphine Okasik, had come to treat the whole thing as a kind of chore she performed for the calendar, like changing the batteries in the smoke detectors. She put the notice in the paper. She put the notice on the county website, where it sat between a surplus mower deck and 4 filing cabinets. She set out the bid box in the recorder's anteroom on the 2nd floor of the courthouse. A gray steel box with a slot cut in the lid, and she taped the notice to the front of it, and she went back to her work. On the morning the bids were opened, there were 9 people in the room, and 8 of them were there for something else. Del Crabtree, the county administrator, was there because the resolution required him to be. He was 55, sandy and thickening, a man who had made his whole career out of being the person who says the practical thing out loud, and he had already scheduled the follow-up meeting where the commissioners would vote to fund the demolition out of the capital fund over 3 fiscal years. He had the agenda for that meeting in his hand. He was reading it while Delphine unlocked the box. Commissioner Verna Hoyt was there because she had spent 2 terms saying that corner ought to be parking, and she wanted to watch the last obstacle to that be nothing. A man named Rand Mulqueen was there in a quarter-zip pullover with a development company's logo on the chest, and he had a site plan folded in his jacket that showed a drive-through pharmacy with 11 spaces and a monument sign. And he had told 2 commissioners privately that he'd take the ground for $1 once the county cleared it. A reporter from the Register was there, 24 years old, with a phone on a little tripod. The maintenance supervisor was there because the maintenance supervisor was always there. 2 people were waiting to record a deed and had simply not been asked to leave. And Ada Farrell was there, in the 3rd chair from the door, with her purse on her knees. She was 74 years old that spring. She was a small woman, not frail but small, with white hair she kept in a low bun and wire-rimmed glasses that she pushed up with one knuckle, and that morning she was wearing a faded plum cardigan over a gray house dress and the same brown shoes she wore everywhere. Because she had exactly 2 pairs, and the other pair was for church and funerals. She had worked in the building she was sitting in for 31 years. Deputy recorder, then chief deputy, then 11 years of retirement in a house on Pearl Street with a furnace she babied through every winter, and a niece in Cincinnati who called on Sundays. Nobody paid her any attention. People in that courthouse had stopped seeing Ada Farrell around 1994. She was the woman who knew where the plat books were. She was furniture with a pension. Delphine turned the little key and lifted the lid of the box and said, in the flat voice of a woman performing a ritual for the 18th time, 1 bid. Del Crabtree looked up from his agenda. 1? 1. There was a shifting in the room. Rand Mulqueen's face did something quick and unhappy. The reporter turned her phone. Delphine slit the envelope with her thumbnail and unfolded a single sheet of lined paper, the kind that comes out of a spiral notebook, with the fringe torn off cleanly along the edge. She read the parcel number. She read the legal description reference. Then she read the name, and she read it the way you read a name you have known for 40 years and are suddenly unsure of. Ada M. Farrell, and then the amount. $2,750. The room made the sound that a small town makes when it is embarrassed for somebody. It is not a laugh exactly. It is a breath let out through the nose in 3 or 4 places at once. And a chair creak and somebody saying, "Oh, honey," under their breath, and it is worse than a laugh, because a laugh you can be angry at. Verna Hoyt turned around in her seat and looked at Ada and said, kindly, which made it worse, "Ada, sweetheart, do you know what that building is?" "I do," Ada said. "There's asbestos in the basement." "There's regulated insulation on the steam lines and around the boiler breaching," Ada said. Page 51. It's encapsulated and it's stable, and the report says it can be managed in place unless the lines are disturbed. The room went a little quieter. "The 5th floor is sagging," Verna said. 1 inch and 3/8 across the center bay, measured at 4 points. And the report says the cause is likely a single shimmed post under the 4th floor bearing line that somebody moved when they put the escalator in 1957, Ada said. Page 63. It doesn't say the floor is failing. It says it can't be certified without opening the ceiling. Del Crabtree set his agenda down on his knee. "Ada," he said, and he used the voice men use when they think they are being gentle. "That's $214,000 of liability you just bid $2,700 on." $2,750, Ada said. "Right, I'd like the deed prepared the standard way," she said. "The same form the county uses on every tax parcel. Full legal description as recorded, carried forward from the original instrument. That's all. Dell smiled at her, the way you smile at a woman who has misunderstood something and is going to find out. You'll get exactly the form we always use, he said. Yes, Ada said. I know. Later, people would say that they should have heard something in that. They did not. What they heard was an old woman spending $2,750 she had saved out of a county pension on a condemned pile of brick, and what they felt was that mixture of pity and relief a town feels when somebody else takes a problem off its hands in a way it can shake its head about later. The reporter came over afterward in the hall and asked her why. Ada thought about it for a second, and then she said something that ran in the register the following Thursday under a photograph of the building taken from across the square. Because in 9 years, she said, nobody read it all the way to the end. The reporter wrote that down and did not understand it, and neither did anybody else, and the paper printed it as a piece of small-town color. The sort of quote you put in because an old woman said it and it sounded nice. To understand what Ada Farrell had done, you have to understand what she did for 31 years, which is a thing almost nobody in Amman could have told you, including people who had stood at her window 100 times. A recorder's office does not keep secrets. It keeps the opposite of secrets. Everything in it is public, every page of it, and any citizen can walk in off the street and ask for any instrument ever filed and be handed it. That is the whole point of the institution. The catch, and it is the catch that runs quietly under half the property in this country, is that nobody ever does. The record is open, and nobody reads it. It sits in numbered volumes on steel shelving in a room with no windows, and the only people who go all the way into it are title examiners chasing a specific chain for a specific closing, and they stop the second they have what they came for. Ada had gone all the way in for 31 years, not for closings, for the index. When she started in 1978, the office was still indexing by hand into ledgers, grantor and grantee, and a copperplate that the older women had learned and taught down. In 1991, the county bought its first system and hired a firm to key 20 years back, and the firm did what firms do, which is key the header data and skip the body. Ada spent the next 2 decades quietly and without authorization reading the bodies. She would take a volume down at lunch. She would take one home in the last hour of a slow Friday, which was against the rules and which everybody knew about and nobody stopped, because the volumes came back and because the alternative was that nobody read them at all. She was not looking for anything. That is the part people get wrong later when they decide she must have been clever. She was not being clever. She simply had the habit of a certain kind of mind, which is that when a sentence in front of her did not resolve, she could not let it alone. And the Marchand instrument had not resolved for her since 1986. It was indeed volume 214, page 331, filed the 2nd of October, 1911, and it was long, because instruments were long then. 2 brothers, Alphonse Marchand and Camille Marchand, taking title to lots 11 and 12 and the north 20 feet of lot 10 in the original town plat from an estate. Courses and distances. Then the standard habendum. Then, at the bottom of page 332 and running over onto 333, one sentence that was not standard at all and that had been carried forward by lawyers too careful or too lazy to drop it through a mortgage in 1923, a corporate conveyance to Austrian Retail Group in 1968. A foreclosure deed in 1983, 2 quitclaims, and finally the tax deed the county took in 2016. She could recite it. She had recited it to herself on the walk to the courthouse that March morning, the way some people say a rosary. together with all buildings, improvements, fixtures, machinery, elevators, shelving, casework, fittings, furnishings, works of art, models, mechanisms, stock in trade, and other contents whatsoever now or hereafter affixed to, installed within, or stored upon the premises hereby conveyed, the same being intended by the parties hereto to pass as one entire property and not in severalty. And no part of the aforesaid shall be severed, removed, or sold apart from the freehold save by written instrument recorded in the office of the recorder of said county. It was a strange clause. It was strange in 1911, and it was stranger by 2026. The reason it existed was mundane. The brothers had borrowed heavily to build, and their lender had wanted to be sure that if the business went down, the fixtures, which in a department store in 1911 were worth nearly as much as the building, all that quarter sawn oak casework and the plate glass and the pneumatic tube system and the 2 Otis elevators could not be quietly carted out the back door on a Sunday and sold, leaving the bank with a brick box. So the lawyer had welded the guts to the shell and recorded the weld, which meant that for 115 years, anything left inside that building could not legally leave it except by a recorded instrument. And Ada, who had spent 31 years indexing every recorded instrument in Delft County, knew a thing that no engineer in Columbus and no county administrator and no developer in a quarter zip pullover knew, which was that no such instrument had ever been recorded. Not once. Not in 1968 when the chain bought it. Not in 1981 when the store closed. Not in 1983 at foreclosure. Not in 2016. Nothing had ever legally come out of that building. She had checked it in 1986 out of curiosity, and again in 1999, and again in 2011, and the last time, in 2017, she had checked it in retirement, sitting at the public terminal in her own old office with her reading glasses on. Feeling faintly ridiculous, an old woman running searches on a building nobody wanted. There was a second thing she knew, and this one was not in the record at all. It was in her. In the fall of 1958, when Ada Farrell was 6 years old, her father had been laid off from the Ammon Tool and Die in the second week of November, along with 40 other men. And her mother had gone to work nights at the poultry plant on the Bellwood Road. That December, Ada had written a letter and put it in the brass box that stood inside the Court Street doors of the Marchand store from the day after Thanksgiving until Christmas Eve, a box with a slot in the top and a sign above it painted in gold on a green board, letters to the North Pole, we answer every one. She had not asked for a toy. She had asked, in the printing of a 6-year-old, whether it would be possible for her mother to have a coat, because her mother's coat was her aunt's old one, and the sleeve had come apart at the shoulder and she walked to the plant. 11 days later, a box came to the house on Pearl Street with no card in it. Inside was a woman's wool coat, size 14, dark green, new. Her mother sat down on the kitchen chair with it in her lap and did not say anything for a long time, and then she said, "Well," and got up and started supper. She wore that coat for 19 years. It was on the hook by the door the night she died. Ada had spent her entire life not knowing where it came from. She had asked when she was old enough to ask. Her mother had said it was from the church, and Ada had known, even at 14, that the church did not have money for wool coats, and that her mother knew it too, and the two of them had let it be, the way families do. But she had also received, that December of 1958, a letter back. A real one. Typed on a small sheet of cream paper with a printed heading, Marchand Bros, Display Department, 5th floor, and signed in ink by a hand she could not read, and it had said that her letter had been received and read carefully, and that some things asked for at Christmas take longer than others and arrive by different roads, and that she should watch the north window on the Court Street side that year, because there was going to be something in it she might like. There had been. A cobbler's shop in the north window with a small bearded man at a bench who lifted a hammer and brought it down on a shoe over and over all through December, and a cat on the sill behind him that turned its head. Ada had stood in front of that window in the cold so many times that her mother had threatened to tie a rope to her. She had kept that letter for 68 years. It was in a tin in her front room with her mother's rings and her own certificate of appointment as deputy recorder, and the reason she had bid $2,750 on a condemned building was not that she was clever and not that she wanted to be right. It was that in 31 years of reading the record all the way to the end, she had never once found the instrument that let the 5th floor of the Marchand building be emptied, which meant it had not been, which meant the cobbler was still up there. The commissioners confirmed the sale on the 11th of March by a vote of 2-1, Verna Hoyt voting no on the record and explaining at some length that she was voting no out of concern for Mrs. Farrell and not out of any objection to the price, and Del Crabtree writing in the minutes that the county's exposure was thereby extinguished. That phrase, the county's exposure was thereby extinguished, would be read aloud in a hearing room 7 weeks later by a lawyer with a small, pleased look on her face, and Del Crabtree would have to sit and listen to it. He did not know that yet. He went home that night and told his wife the old Farrell woman had bought the Marchand, and his wife said, "Which one is that?" And he said the one on the square, the dead one, and his wife said, "Huh." And that was the extent of it. Ada paid in a cashier's check drawn on the Farmers and Merchants, $2,750 even, which was very close to the whole of what she had in the account that was not the account she lived on. She signed the acceptance in the recorder's office at the window where she had stood on the other side for 31 years, and the young woman who took it, Darcy, had been hired in 2015 and had never worked a day with Ada and did not know quite what to make of the old lady who kept saying, "You don't have to stamp it twice, honey. The machine does it." The deed was recorded on the 18th of March, instrument number 2026-1449, and Ada asked for a certified copy, and she paid the $2 a page for it out of her purse like any member of the public, and she read all 9 pages standing at the counter before she left the building. The clause was there, carried forward whole, exactly as it had ridden through every conveyance since 1911. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had ever had a reason to. She walked home with it in a manila envelope under her arm, and she did not go inside her house right away. She stood at the end of her own walk on Pearl Street in the wind for a minute or two, holding a building. The keys came the following Tuesday in a bank envelope from the county maintenance department, 11 keys on a loop of wire, most of them for doors that no longer existed, and a note in ballpoint that said court stentrance is the brass one, don't use the alley door, the frame is bad. She did not go alone. She was 74 and she had read page 51 of that report, and she was not a fool. She called Ozzie Nunes. Ozzie Nunes was 68 and had been the last maintenance man Marchand Bros ever employed. Hired in 1972 at 14 as a stock boy, made building man in 1977 when the old building man's back went, and let go in January 1981 with everybody else. He had spent the 45 years since as a school custodian at Ammon High and had retired the previous spring and did not know what to do with himself. He was a stocky man with a white mustache who wore a tan canvas work jacket in every season and a flat wool cap, and when Ada called him and said, "Ozzie, I bought the store," there was a silence on the line long enough that she said his name again. "You bought it," he said. "I did. With what?" "With money." Another silence. "Ada," he said, "the freight elevator's on a separate service, and the disconnect is in the basement behind the transformer vault, and there's a Fenwal panel that ain't been looked at since Carter." "I know," she said. "That's why I called you." They went in on the 24th of March at 9 in the morning, a Tuesday, cold and bright. Ozzy had a spotlight on a car battery in a milk crate and a 50-foot cord and a hard hat that he made Ada put on and that sat on her head like a cake stand and a can of penetrating oil and a piece of chalk. Ada had a legal pad, a certified copy of the deed in a plastic sleeve, and a flashlight she had bought at the hardware for $9. The brass key turned. The Court Street doors were a revolving door flanked by two swing doors, and the revolving door had been chained, and the chain had rusted into a solid piece of iron sculpture, so they went in the north swing door, and it dragged on the terrazzo and made a noise like a held note. And then they were standing inside the Marchand building for the first time in 45 years, in the dark, with the plywood glowing at the edges around the windows. It smelled like a closed piano. That was the thing Ada could never explain properly afterward. Dust and old varnish and cold plaster, and underneath it, faintly, something sweet and gone that might have been 45-year-old face powder from the cosmetics island by the door. Ozzy put the spotlight up. The ground floor was almost entirely there. That was the first shock. People had assumed for decades that the place had been stripped, because that is what people assume, and it had not been. And it had not been for the plain reason that stripping a building costs money, and nobody had ever had a reason to spend it. The oak casework ran the length of the east wall, glass fronts intact, brass poles green. The cosmetics island was there with its mirrored back. The terrazzo floor had the Marchand M set into it in brass and black at the corner entrance. And Ozzy went down on one knee and rubbed at it with his thumb until the brass came up yellow. "Huh," he said, which for Ozzy Nunez was a speech. The escalator was there, the 1957 one, wooden treads, standing dead in the middle of the floor like a bridge to nowhere. The pneumatic tube station was still bolted under the wrap counter, 6 brass tubes going up into the ceiling. Behind the counter, on a hook, was a cardigan. Ada looked at that cardigan for a while and did not touch it. They did the second floor and the third floor. Water damage on the third from the northeast corner where a scupper had failed, plaster down in 2 rooms, the floor stained and springy in a 10-foot circle that Ozzy chalked an X around and told her to walk wide of forever. Otherwise, fitting rooms with their little louvered doors, a shoe department with its slanted mirrors at floor level, a beauty parlor with 4 chairs and their hood dryers still on their stands, and in the corner of the third floor, behind a door with a frosted glass panel, an office with a roll-top desk, and a wall calendar for 1981 turned to January. The fourth floor was furniture and rugs, and it was the worst of them, because pigeons had gotten in through the light court at some point in the 90s, and the whole northeast quarter was a foot deep in filth. They did not linger. Ozzy put his sleeve over his face and got them out, and then they came to the stair to 5, and there was no stair to 5. There was a wall. It was concrete block, 8-inch, running floor to ceiling across the stair enclosure, painted the same institutional gray as the rest of the 4th floor service corridor, and it was old enough that the paint had gone chalky and the mortar joints had the soft look that mortar gets after 50 years. It had been laid by somebody who knew what he was doing. There were no seams at the jambs. There was a metal plate screwed over where the door hardware had been, and on the plate somebody had stenciled in black the words "No Access, CMGR." Ada stood in front of it with her $9 flashlight. "Well," Ozzy said, "you knew about this. I laid the block," Ozzy said. "They sat on the 4th floor stair landing to talk about it, because there was nowhere else to sit, and because Ozzy Nunez needed to sit down." He was 20 years old in October of 1978, he said. He had been building man for a year. The store had belonged to Ostran Retail Group out of Toledo since 1968, and Ostran ran 14 stores and was in the process of doing to all 14 what chains do, which is to find every place where a store was doing something for itself and make it stop. The display department was one of those places. Ammon had its own. It had had its own since the building opened, because Alphonse Marchand had come back from Chicago in 1911 convinced that windows were the whole business, and it occupied the entire 5th floor, a shop with benches and a lathe and a sewing room and a paint bay and racks for backdrops, and above the freight elevator, a hoist that could put a finished piece straight down into the alley. Truck. And it had had, since 1936, a man named Emile van der Leyen. Belgian, Ozzie said, came over in 28, worked for a theater outfit in Cleveland doing scenery, and then the theater outfit went under, and old man Marchand got him for $11 a week and a room. He was here 42 years. 42. Emile van der Leyen had died in August of 1978 at 73 years old, in the shop, in the afternoon, at the bench, and Ozzie had been the one who found him, and Ozzie did not say anything else about that part. Ostran's district man came down from Toledo in September and walked the 5th floor for 11 minutes with a clipboard. Ozzie remembered 11 minutes because he had been standing there the whole time waiting to be told what to do. The district man wrote that the display function would be consolidated at the Toledo warehouse effective immediately, that seasonal sets would be supplied on a rotation from the group's inventory, and that the 5th floor was to be secured against unauthorized entry as it was not to be occupied and the store's insurance rate reflected occupied floors. He didn't say get rid of it, Ozzie said. That's the thing I want you to understand, Ada. He never once said get rid of it. He said secure it. Because getting rid of it costs money and securing it costs $40 in block. So in the second week of October 1978, a 20-year-old maintenance man had carried 82 concrete blocks up 4 flights of service stair on a hand truck and mixed mortar in a wheelbarrow on the 4th floor and walled up the only stair to the 5th floor of the Marchand building, and then gone down to the basement and pulled the fuses on the freight elevator's separate service and hung a tag on the disconnect and put the tag's key in the manager's key cabinet where it sat until 1981 and then went into a box that went to Toledo and was never seen again. There was 9-10 years of work in that shop, Ozzie said. More, all of it his. And I bricked it up in a day and a half and got paid $4 and change an hour to do it, and I have thought about it a lot. Why didn't you ever say anything? Ada asked. Ozzie looked at the block wall. Who was I going to say it to? He said. The store closed 27 months later. Everybody had bigger problems. And then it was 10 years, and then it was 30, and then it was a building nobody could go in. You don't tell people about a room they can't get into. All that does is make them sad. Ada sat on the stair with her hands on her knees. Ozzie, she said, what's in it? Everything, he said. Everything he ever made that came back in. The store never threw a window out. They went back up and got repaired and went out again the next year or the year after. He had them in crates on the north wall, numbered with a book. And the last 2 years after his heart got bad and they had him on half days, that's all he did. He didn't make anything new. He just went through and packed everything he'd ever made and wrote it all in that book and put lids on. Why? Because he knew, Ozzie said. He knew what Ostrand was. He'd watched it happen at the Fostoria store. He packed it all up so whoever came after could find it. He rubbed his mustache with the back of his hand. And then nobody came after, he said. They did not open the wall that day. Ada would not let him, and he would not have let her either. Because neither of them knew what the floor above was doing, and the report said 1 3/8 of sag, and Ada Farrell had not read 91 pages in order to die in a stairwell. What they did instead took 5 weeks, and it is the part of this story that nobody ever tells, because it is not dramatic. It was permits. Ada Farrell went to the Ammon Building Department on the 26th of March and stood at the counter and asked Harlan Pace what he needed. Harlan Pace was the city building official, 51, a former union carpenter. A slow talker with an entirely undramatic sense of duty, and he had been braced for 2 weeks for the arrival of an old woman who was going to yell at him about her condemned building. What arrived instead was an old woman with a legal pad who asked him, in order, what he needed to allow entry to a sealed floor, whether a structural engineer's letter limited to the 5th floor framing would satisfy him rather than a whole building certification, whether he would accept shoring designed by that engineer, and whether he would prefer she pull the permit as owner or have a contractor of record. Harlan Pace said afterward that it was the single most pleasant conversation he had had with a property owner in 11 years. The engineer was a woman named Priya Ganesan out of Zanesville who did small commercial work and charged Ada $2,200, which Ada did not have and which she got by selling her mother's rings, all of them except the plain gold one, to a jeweler in Newark who gave her a fair price and told her twice that she did not have to do this. Priya Ganesan came on the 9th of April with a laser and a moisture meter and spent 6 hours in the building and came back on the 16th with a letter. The letter said the 5th floor sag was old, static, and not progressing, and that the cause was almost certainly what Ada had said at the bid opening, a bearing post relocated during the 1957 escalator installation and never properly picked up. It said the floor could carry ordinary occupancy at the perimeter immediately and at the center bay after 4 shores were placed on the 4th floor beneath the center bearing line. It said the parapet on Court Street should be netted within the year. It said the roof was shot but not open. And it said, in the last paragraph, that in the engineer's opinion, the building was in materially better condition than the 2019 report suggested, because the 2019 report had never entered the 5th floor and had assumed, in the absence of access, the worst case. Ada read that paragraph 4 times. The shores went in on the 22nd of April, 4 steel posts on plates on the 4th floor. And Ozzie set them himself with a rented laser, and Harlan Pace came and looked at them and signed the card on the 23rd. And on the morning of the 24th of April, Ozzie Nunes put a demolition saw against the block wall he had built 48 years earlier and cut a doorway back into it. He cut it in 4 passes and knocked the pieces in with a sledge, and they fell on the stair treads with a flat sound, and dust came out of the opening in a slow gray roll and hung in the spotlight, and behind the dust there was a stair going up into black, and on the risers of that stair, undisturbed for 48 years, was a soft gray felt of dust with nothing in it. No prints, no droppings, nothing. A sealed room is the only clean room in an old building. Ozzie stepped back and took his cap off. "You first," he said. "Don't be ridiculous," Ada said. "You built the wall. That's why," he said. They went up together in the end, Ada on the rail side and Ozzie behind her with the spotlight, and 22 treads later, they came out through a doorway into the 5th floor of the Marchand building. The first thing was light. Neither of them had expected light. The 5th floor had a sawtooth monitor along the roof, a row of north-facing glazed lights that Alphonse Marchand had put in specifically so that his display men could see color true, and 48 years of grime had not stopped it. It came down in wide, dim bars through the dust they had brought up with them, and it lay on a floor of wide maple boards. And it showed them a room 160 feet long. It was a workshop. It was completely absolutely a workshop, in the way that a workshop is when a man has been in it for 42 years and then simply stopped one afternoon. There were 4 benches down the center under the monitor lights, maple tops worn into shallow dishes where hands had gone for decades. There was a wood lathe and a bandsaw and a drill press on the north wall with their belts slack and gray. There was a paint bay behind a canvas curtain with a rack of hardening jars and a row of brushes in a coffee can with their bristles still shaped. There was a sewing room in a partition of glass and wood with 2 treadle machines and 1 electric, and bolts of velvet and duvetton on a rack. Gone dull at the exposed edge and perfectly good 6 inches in, there was a rack of rolled backdrops standing on end like organ pipes, 40 or 50 of them, each with a tag wired to the top, and on the north wall, stacked 3 high on dunnage, running 50 feet, were the crates. Ada counted them out loud without meaning to. 41. They were plywood, made in the shop, each about the size of a chest freezer, some bigger. Each had a number stenciled on the end in the same black paint, and under the number a line of hand lettering in a small European hand. Ozzie put the light on the nearest one. No, 12, cobbler, bench, figure, cat, 3 backdrops, cams in drawer. Ada Farrell put her hand flat on the end of that crate and stood there so long that Ozzie came around to look at her face. You all right? Yes, she said, and it came out badly, and she said it again, and it came out fine. On the bench nearest the stair, laid out square, was the last day of Emil van der Lein's life, a cup with an inch of something in the bottom, long gone to a hard brown disk. A pair of reading glasses folded, a pencil, and a ledger opened flat with an entry begun and not finished, the pen stroke trailing off in the middle of a word, the loop of an L that goes up and does not come down. Ozzie looked at it and turned away and stood facing the sewing room with his cap in his hands for a while. The ledger was the book he had told her about. It was a stationer's ledger, marbled boards, and on the first page, in that same hand, it said, Display Department, Inventory of Works, E. van der Leyen, begun 3 January 1976. Every crate had a page. Every page had a list. Every list had, at the bottom, a line in a different color of ink, added later, that said what condition the piece was in and what it wanted. Crate 12, cobbler's right arm cam worn, recut. Crate 19, swan neck linkage stiff, oil. Crate 27, bakery dough figure hands repainted 1971, colors do not match originals, see jar samples rack B. He had gone through all of it, piece by piece, in his last 2 years on half days with a bad heart. And he had told whoever came next exactly what was wrong with everything and where to find the paint. They did not open a crate that day either. Ada wanted to, and Ozzie said no, and he was right, because they had no idea what 48 years of Ohio temperature swing had done to glue and gut and cloth, and because a thing that has waited that long can wait a week for somebody to know what they are doing. The person who knew what she was doing turned out to live 19 miles away in Utica and to be 29 years old. Her name was Junie Kowal, and she had a degree in art conservation from a school in Delaware and no job in it, because there are about 11 such jobs in Ohio, and she was managing the coffee counter at the Kroger in Newark and doing furniture touch-up on weekends for an antique mall. Priya Ganesan knew her mother. Priya made a phone call. Junie Kowal came on the 29th of April in a car with a bad muffler, walked up 22 treads, stood in the doorway of the 5th floor of the Marchand building, and said a word that Ada Farrell pretended not to hear. Then she said, "Nobody knows this is here?" 4 people, Ada said. Junie walked the length of the room slowly, touching nothing, with her hands held slightly away from her sides the way people do in churches. "That's a Wagner," she said at the lathe, And at the backdrop rack, those are distemper on canvas. If any of those got wet, you have soup, but they're on end and they're dry. And at the paint bay, are those his original color samples? With the formulas? Rack B, Ada said. Junie turned around. You've read the book. I've read the book, Ada said. They opened crate number 12 on the 2nd of May at 11 in the morning, with Junie directing and Ozzy on the screwdriver and Ada holding a light and a fourth person present who mattered a great deal later, which was Harlan Pace, the building official, who had come to look at the shores and had somehow not left. The screws came out. There were 40 of them, brass, and every one turned. Under the lid was Excelsior, packed tight, dry as paper. Junie took it out in handfuls and laid it aside, because you never know what is in the packing. Under the Excelsior was a layer of cotton wadding, and under that, wrapped in a bedsheet, was a bench. It was a cobbler's bench about 4 feet long, made of poplar and painted to look like oak. Worn convincingly at the front edge with a rasp and a glaze, and it had a rack of tiny wooden lasts along the back and a shelf of leather scraps, and every scrap was real leather and hand-cut. Then, the figure. He came out on his back with his arms folded, 31 inches tall, and Junie Cowell handled him like a baby with a broken collarbone. A bearded man in a leather apron, head of carved basswood, face painted in oils, beard of real hair set in 100 at a time, eyes of glass, hands carved separately at the wrist with the fingers positioned around a hammer that was not with him because the hammer was wrapped separately in tissue in a box marked 12A. His face was extraordinary. That was the thing nobody was ready for. It was not a doll's face, and it was not a mannequin's face. It was a specific man's face, an old craftsman with a broad nose and heavy lids and deep lines at the corners of his eyes, and he looked patient and slightly amused, the way a man looks when he is doing something with his hands that he has done 50,000 times and is still not bored by. Ada Farrell sat down on an upturned crate and cried, which she had not done at her mother's funeral and had not done when she retired and had not done in the bid room. I stood in front of him, she said, when she could. I was 6. Junie Cowell, who was 29 and had been holding her professional composure together for 4 days with both hands, said, "Ma'am, I've worked on 2 things in my life that were this good, and they were both in museums." Under the figure, in a drawer built into the crate, wrapped in oiled paper, were the cams, a hardwood shaft, hand-turned with 4 cams keyed to it, and a set of brass rocker arms and push rods, and a linkage of thin steel bar, and a motor the size of a coffee can with a gearbox, and a plate that said Bodine Electric CO. Chicago, that was the mechanism that made the arm come up, and the hammer come down, and the head turn a few degrees at the top of the stroke, and it had a rhythm to it. A slightly irregular rhythm, because Emil van der Laan had cut the cam so that the hammer paused a half beat at the top, the way a real man pauses, which is the entire difference between a machine and a thing that seems alive. Junie found that half beat with her finger on the cam profile before she ever saw it run. "Oh," she said quietly. "Oh, he was good." It got out the way things get out in a town of 9,000, which is that Harlan Pace told his wife, and his wife taught 4th grade. By the 8th of May, there were people standing on the sidewalk across Court Street looking up at a building they had walked past for 45 years. By the 11th, the Register had run a photograph on the front page of the cobbler figure, lying on a moving blanket with Junie Cowell's gloved hand beside him for scale, and by the 14th, that photograph had been picked up by a paper in Columbus, and by the 17th, a man from a television station in Cleveland had driven down and stood in front of the plywood with a microphone and said the words "hidden treasure," which Ada Farrell hated so much that she went in the back way for a week. And on the 21st of May, Ada Farrell received a letter from the Delft County Prosecutor's Office, Civil Division, on behalf of the Board of County Commissioners, informing her that the county had identified an irregularity in the sale of Parcel 8 100 and 1421 and intended to move to set the conveyance aside. The theory was not stupid. That is worth saying, because it would be easy to make Del Crabtree into a cartoon, and he was not one. The theory was that the notice of sale published in the Register had described the property as improved real property, 5-story commercial building, approximately 41,000 square feet, and had said nothing about contents that the county had never inventoried, appraised, or intended to convey personal property. That the auctioneer standard terms attached to every county sale said buildings and land only, all personal property removed prior to closing, and that where the published notice and the recorded instrument conflict, the sale was based on a material mistake and should be rescinded, with the county returning the $2,750 and taking the parcel back. What was behind the theory was simpler. Somebody had put a number on the crates. The number came from a dealer in Chicago named Whitcomb, who handled animated display figures for a market that most people do not know exists, and who had called the county administrator's office on the 19th of May, 2 days after the Cleveland broadcast, and had said on the phone to a woman in the administrator's office that if what he was seeing on television was what he thought it was, he could place them at $15,000 to $22,000 apiece to collectors and to 2 theme operators he named, and that a complete documented shop of a single maker was, in his words, a once-in-a-career thing. 41 crates. Some crates held more than one figure. The ledger listed 109 figures in all. Somebody in the administrator's office did the arithmetic on a sticky note. The sticky note was later produced in Discovery, which is a thing that happens to sticky notes, and it said in ballpoint 109x 18,000 cucks, 1,962,000, and underneath it, Del Crabtree said afterward, and there is no reason to disbelieve him, that his concern was fiduciary. The county had sold for $2,750 an asset that might be worth $2 million, and he was the administrator, and if he had shrugged at that, he would have deserved to lose his job. That was true. It was also true that Verna Hoyt still wanted a parking lot, and that Rand Mulqueen had been at the courthouse twice that week, and that both of those things were also true at the same time, because in a small county, everything is true at the same time. Ada Farrell got the letter on a Thursday. She read it standing at her mailbox. Then she went inside and sat at her kitchen table and did not call a lawyer for 2 days because she wanted to think, and because she did not have a lawyer, and because she had spent $2,200 on an engineer and did not know how she would pay one. The lawyer came to her. Her name was Odile Brandt. She was 44. She practiced in Zanesville. And she had grown up in Amman and had, at 9 years old, in 1991, stood in front of a window at the Marchand, the last year they set the old sets, before the Toledo rotation had fully taken over, and watched a swan turn its neck over a frozen pond. She called Ada and said she would handle it for costs, and Ada said absolutely not. And Odile Brandt said, in a tone that ended it, "Mrs. Farrell, I am not doing this for you." The hearing was on the 9th of July in the courtroom on the 3rd floor of the courthouse before Judge Renwick, and it lasted an afternoon, and about 60 people came, which for a civil motion in Delft County is a mob. The county went first. The assistant prosecutor was competent and quick. He put up the published notice. He put up the auctioneer's standard terms. He put Del Crabtree on to say that the county had never intended to convey 109 figures and would never have advertised such a sale at a minimum bid of $1, and Del Crabtree said it plainly and did not embarrass himself. Then Odile Brandt stood up and asked Del Crabtree 3 questions. The first was whether the county's standard tax deed form incorporates the legal description as recorded in the last instrument of record. Dell said yes, it does. The second was whether the county had, at any time in the 9 years the parcel was advertised, read the legal description in the last instrument of record. Dell said the county relies on the description prepared by the auditor's office. The third was whether the county, in 2016, when it took the parcel by tax deed, had recorded any instrument severing any contents, fixture, or chattel from the freehold. Del Crabtree said he would have to check. You don't have to check, Odell Brandt said. There isn't one. I pulled the whole chain. There has never been one, from 1911 to today. And the reason there has never been one is that the 1911 instrument says there cannot be one except by a recorded writing, and no party in 115 years has ever bothered to write it. Then she read the clause into the record. She read it slowly, all of it, the way it had been written, and the courtroom went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when a document written before anybody in it was born starts telling them what is going to happen. Then she said, the county's position is that it did not know what it owned. That is not a mistake of fact that voids a sale. That is a failure to read a public record that has been sitting in a public office in this building 40 feet below where we are sitting since October of 1911. My client read it. She read it in 1986 and 1999 and 2011 and 2017 because she was the chief deputy recorder of this county for 31 years and reading it was, quite literally, her job. The county's exposure was thereby extinguished. Those are the county's own minutes, March 11th. Judge Renwick took 11 days. The entry, when it came, ran 9 pages and turned on 1 paragraph. A grantor is charged with knowledge of its own record. The county could not claim mistake as to a covenant that had been in its own recorder's office continuously for 115 years, indexed under both grantor and grantee names, and which the county itself had carried forward in its own tax deed in 2016. The published notice did not narrow the recorded description. The recorded description controlled. There was no fraud, no misrepresentation, and no concealment by the purchaser, who had disclosed at the bid opening in the presence of the administrator and a commissioner that she wanted the deed prepared with the full legal description as recorded, and who had been told by the administrator on the record that she would get exactly the form the county always used. Motion denied. There is a photograph from the courthouse steps that afternoon. Ada Farrell is in the plum cardigan with her purse over her arm, and she is not smiling and she is not triumphant. She looks tired and a little annoyed, like a woman who has been kept from her work. Ozzie Nunes is behind her with his cap in his hand. The room at the south end of the 5th floor had a door with a frosted panel, and the panel said correspondence, and for 8 weeks nobody had gone into it, because 8 weeks had been taken up by crates and shores and lawyers. Junie Kowal opened it on the 24th of July because she was looking for a cabinet to put brushes in. It was 10 feet by 12. There was a small oak desk, a chair, an Underwood typewriter with a sheet still rolled into the platen, and on 3 walls, floor to ceiling, wooden filing drawers. Not cabinets. Built-in drawers, made in the shop out of shop plywood, shallow, each with a card holder on the front, and in each card holder a card, hand-lettered. 1936, 1937, 1938, all the way around the room to 1978. Junie pulled 1952. It was full of letters from children, not copies. The letters themselves, the originals, in pencil, in crayon, on lined paper, and on the backs of feed store calendars, and on stationery from the Aman Hotel, folded once, bundled by month with string, several hundred to a bundle, and clipped to the front of every single bundle a carbon. The carbons were the replies. Each one typed on that underwood on the cream paper with the printed heading, Marchand Bros, Display Department, 5th floor. Each one addressed to a specific child by name, each one different. The sign in the store had said, "We answer every one," and a man had gone up to the 5th floor after his shift for 42 years and answered every one. They called Ada. She came up the stairs slower than usual because it was July and the 5th floor in July was 104 degrees, and Junie put a folding chair in front of the 1958 drawer and did not say anything and went and stood in the sewing room with her back turned. Ada found it in the December bundle, 14 letters down. The paper had gone the color of weak tea. The printing was hers, large and careful and slanting downhill toward the right margin the way a 6-year-old's does when she is running out of room and will not start a new line. It asked about a coat. It said the sleeve had come apart at the shoulder and that her mother walked to the plant on the Bellwood Road and that it was 3 miles and it was cold. It did not ask for anything else. It said thank you, and it said Ada M. Farrell, 61 Pearl St. Clipped. Clipped to the bundle in the right place was the carbon of the reply, the same letter she had kept in a tin for 68 years, word for word, the top copy of which was at that moment 11 blocks away in her front room. And clipped behind the carbon, which she had never had, was a receipt. It was from Dornbach's, which had been a dry goods store on Main until 1969. It was dated the 11th of December, 1958. It was for one lady's wool coat, size 14, green, $17.95, and delivery, 50 cents. And across the bottom, in ink in a small European hand, charge to E. Vanderline, do not enter on store account. Ada Farrell sat in a folding chair on the 5th floor of a building she had bought for $2,750 in 104 degrees holding a piece of paper for a long time. Then she went looking, because she was who she was, and she found it in the bottom drawer of the oak desk under a box of typewriter ribbons. Another ledger, smaller, cloth boards, and on the cover in the same hand one word. Extras, it began in 1937 and ended in June of 1978, 2 months before he died. It was a list of what a man had bought out of his own wages for 41 years. Coal, 1 2-ton, Rasmussen, Depot Saint, 1941. Spectacles, boy, Dr. Lou, 1943. Shoes, girls, 2 Prar, 1947. Bus fare, Cleveland, mother and child to clinic, 1949, and again 1950, and again 1951. Coat, ladies, Dernbach, 1958. Tuition, 1 term, business college, do not tell the family, 1961. Rent, Nove, Kolar, 1963. 219 entries. Never a name of the recipient after 1944, after that it was always initials or a street or nothing at all, never a total. Emil Vanderline had never once added it up. He had earned, in his best year, $10,400. Junie Kowal, who had taken the ledger from Ada's hands because Ada's hands were shaking, worked out later that the man had given away something between 11 and 14% of his income every year for 4 decades to children who had written to a brass box in a store lobby thinking they were writing to the North Pole, and that not one of them had ever known. That was the 24th of July. On the 6th of August, the dealer from Chicago came to Ammon in person. His name was Whitcomb, and he was courteous, and he was not a villain either. He was simply a man in a trade. He came up the 22 treads in good shoes and walked the shop for 2 hours and said intelligent things and knew what the backdrops were and knew what the paint samples were worth and was visibly, genuinely moved by the cobbler's face. He was the first person other than Junie who used the word Irv, and he used it correctly. Then he sat down with Ada at the bench under the monitor lights and made his offer. $340,000 cash for the contents of the crates. He would leave the shop, the tools, the backdrops, the ledgers, all of it. He wanted the 109 figures and their mechanisms. He was open about the arithmetic. He told her he would place them over 3 to 5 years and expected to gross considerably more, and that the difference was his risk and his Rolodex, and that she should understand that clearly before she answered. He also said, and this was the part that was hard, that the money would put a roof on the building, because that was true. The roof was $91,000. The parapet was $22,000. The elevators were $140,000 if anybody ever wanted them running, and the fire alarm was $40,000, and the heating plant did not exist anymore in any meaningful sense. Ada Farrell was 74 years old and had a pension of $2,106 a month and had sold her mother's rings to pay an engineer, and there was a man at her elbow offering $340,000 to take away some wooden dolls. She asked him for one thing before she answered, which was whether she could ask him a question about his trade. He said, of course. When you sell the cobbler, she said, does the buyer get the letter? Whitcomb said he did not follow. There's a drawer downstairs with about 900 letters in it from December of 1958, Ada said. One of them is why the cobbler is a cobbler. The man made a scene every year out of whatever the children asked him for that he couldn't buy. That's what the windows were. That's the whole thing. If a man in Nashville buys the cobbler, does he get the drawer? No, Whitcomb said. The drawer stays with the archive. He'd get a copy of the provenance. Then what he's buying is a doll, Ada said. And what's here isn't a doll. She said no. She said it kindly, and she said it once, and she did not waver afterward. Not in October, when the roof estimate came back $9,000 higher, and not in November, when a pipe let go in the 4th floor mop closet and cost her $1,100 she did not have. Whitcomb, to his credit, wrote her a letter in September saying that he had thought about the conversation a good deal and that he had been wrong. And he enclosed a check for $4,000 marked as a donation, and Ada cashed it and put it toward the netting on the parapet. What she did instead of taking the money was the thing that changed the town, and it started with a notice she typed herself on a computer at the public library because she did not own one, and had printed at the copy shop for 11 cents a page. And taped inside the glass of the Court Street door where the plywood had been cut back, it said, "The north window will be lit on the evening of the 28th of November. If you wrote a letter to this building between 1936 and 1978, your letter is upstairs. We will find it for you. There is no charge." A. Farrell, the first person, came on a Tuesday morning in August. She was 81 and her name was Roberta Salzer, and she had written in 1953, and she stood in the lobby among the dust sheets with her purse held in front of her in both hands like a shield, and Junie Kowal went up and came back down 40 minutes later with a piece of lined paper and a carbon. Mrs. Salzer had asked at 8 years old for her brother to come home. Her brother had been in Korea. The carbon reply said that the writer was not able to bring anybody home and would not pretend otherwise, but that he would put her brother's name on a card in the window with all the other names of Amman men away that year so that everybody walking past on Court Street would see it. And that if her brother came home, she should come and tell him, and he would take the card down himself and give it to her. Clipped behind the carbon was the card, a rectangle of green board 4 inches by 2 with a name lettered on it in gold. He had never taken it down. Her brother had not come home. Roberta Salzer sat down on a folding chair in the lobby of the Marchand building and held a piece of green board for a while, and then she asked whether they needed anybody to sweep. That was how it went, all through August and September and October. They came for their letters and they stayed to work. By the end of September, there were between 15 and 40 people in the building on any given Saturday, and Ozzie Nunes had a clipboard and had discovered, to his own surprise, that he was good at telling people what to do. Ammon Hardware gave the paint. The IGA sent lunch on Saturdays without being asked and without ever mentioning it. Two brothers who ran a heating company put in a temporary construction heater on the first floor for the cost of the propane. The high school shop class, under a teacher named Renfro, who had been trying for 6 years to make his kids care about hand tools, adopted the backdrop rack and built 40 new storage cradles for it out of donated pine. And the money came in the way money comes in a small town, which is badly and in pieces and just barely enough. A church breakfast raised $900. A GoFundMe that Junie set up and that Ada refused to look at raised $31,000 in 11 days after the Columbus paper ran the Extras ledger. The County Historical Society, which had $1,100 and no building, voted its whole treasury. The roof did not get done that year. It got half done, the north half, over the shop, which was where it mattered. For $52,000, and the contractor, a man from Cossacton named Delacroix, did the second half in the spring at his cost and would not discuss it. The work on the window itself took 94 days. Junie Kowal did the conservation, and Ada paid her $400 a week out of the fund, which was less than the Kroger and which Junie took, and which was the first job in her field she had ever had. The cobbler needed his left hand reset at the wrist joint where the glue block had failed. He needed 40% of his beard laid back in, hair by hair, with a needle. He needed his apron rebuilt because leather does not survive 48 years of Ohio the way wood does. And Junie found the pattern for it in the sewing room in an envelope marked 12 with the original stitch holes still in the paper. She did not repaint his face. She was very firm about that with a woman from the Historical Society who thought he looked dull. She cleaned it with saliva on a swab, which is what conservators actually use and which nobody believes. And under 60 years of soot and 48 of dust, the man's face came up with color in the cheeks and a wet highlight on the lower lip that Emil van der Leyen had put there with a brush with 3 hairs in it. Ozzie did the mechanism. He cleaned the Bodine motor and had it rewound in Zanesville for $280. He made a new push rod because one had gone at a solder joint. He would not touch the cams. He said the cams were the man's handwriting. And Harlan Pace, the building official, who had by then given up any pretense of being an impartial regulator and had started coming on Sundays, rebuilt the window itself. The plate glass had gone in 1994 when a truck backed into it, and the opening had been plywooded ever since. And Harlan measured and ordered and set a new light of glass, 11 feet by 7, with 3 men and 4 suction cups and a great deal of holding of breath on the 9th of November. They ran the cobbler for the first time on the 14th of November at 9 at night, on the 5th floor, on the bench, with 11 people standing around. Ozzie put the plug in. The motor came up to speed with a hum, and the shaft turned, and the linkage took up, and the arm rose, and at the top of the stroke it stopped, a half beat, no more, and the head turned 4 degrees, and then the hammer came down on the shoe, and came up, and paused, and came down. Nobody said anything. Roberta Salzer put her hand over her mouth. Junie Kowal, who had a master's degree and had been professional about all of it for 6 months, turned around and walked into the sewing room again. It ran for 11 minutes before Ozzie shut it off, and in those 11 minutes, not one person in that room could stop watching the pause at the top of the stroke, because that pause was a Belgian scenery painter who died at a bench in 1978, telling everybody in the room that he had been alive. The 28th of November was a Friday, and it was 29 degrees, and the wind came down Court Street the way it always has, out of the northwest, around the corner of the courthouse, straight into the face of anybody standing in front of the Marchand building. They came anyway. Ammon has 9,000 people. The Register estimated the crowd at 2,200. Which was almost certainly too high, and which nobody has ever contested, because by 6 o'clock Court Street was closed from 2nd to 4th, and the sheriff's office had put out cones without being asked, and the Methodists had a table with cocoa on it, and the line for the cocoa went past the bank. There were people there who had driven from Columbus and Cleveland, and one couple from Fort Wayne. But mostly there were people from Ammon, and among them, standing in the cold in ones and twos with the particular stillness of the very old, were maybe 60 people who had written a letter to a brass box in that lobby when they were children. The window was curtained with a drop cloth on a wire. At 6:30, Ada Farrell came out of the north swing door in the plum cardigan with a coat over it and stood on the sidewalk, and a young man from the radio station handed her a microphone she had not asked for and did not want, and she held it away from herself like a wet umbrella and said 4 sentences. She said, "This is not mine. It was never mine. I just read the paperwork." The man who made what's behind this curtain was named Emil Vanderleyen, and he worked on the 5th floor of this building for 42 years, and he answered every letter any child in this town ever wrote to him. Some of you are going to see your own handwriting tonight. Then she gave the microphone back and nodded at Ozzie, and Ozzie Nunes pulled the drop cloth off the wire. The north window of the Marchand building had been dark for 45 years and boarded for 32. Inside it was a cobbler's shop, board walls, a plank floor, a small stove with a red bulb in it, 3 backdrops in depth so that through the shop's painted window you could see a painted street and, past the street, a painted hill with snow on it. And the near backdrop and the far backdrop lit separately so that the far one had that blue that snow has at dusk. Boots on a shelf, a cat on the sill with its head turning slowly, and at the bench, in a leather apron, an old craftsman with a broad nose and heavy lids raised a hammer and stopped and turned his head 4 degrees toward the street and brought the hammer down on a shoe and raised it again. The sound that a crowd of 2,000 people makes when it goes quiet all at once is a real sound. There is an intake, and then a kind of settling, and then nothing but the wind, and faintly, through 11 feet by 7 of new plate glass, the hum of a rewound Bodine motor from Chicago. A woman named Delphine Okasek, who had opened a bid box 18 times. Stood in that crowd and cried without any dignity whatsoever. Del Crabtree came. That should be said plainly, because he did not have to, and because a smaller man would not have. He stood near the back with his hands in his coat pockets, and he watched the window for a long time, and afterward he went up to Ada Farrell in the doorway and said, "I was wrong about the building." "You were wrong about the record," Ada said. "The building you were right about. It needs a roof. How much of a roof? 41 more. He put the county's share in the capital budget in January, and it passed 3-0. Verna Hoyt voting yes and saying, for the minutes, that she had always thought the corner had potential. But the thing that mattered most that night happened at the edges, away from the window, and there is no photograph of it. Junie Kowal and 2 volunteers had set a folding table under the awning with 4 card boxes on it and a sign that said letters, "Look up your name." And all evening people came up to that table and gave their name and the year and stood there while a young woman went through cards. An 88-year-old man named Verlon Prue found his letter from 1946 asking for a bicycle, and the carbon reply explaining, in 3 sentences, that the writer could not send a bicycle, but that the Hobart boy on Sycamore had outgrown his, and that if Verlon went by there on Saturday morning, something might be leaning against the porch. Verlin Prue had ridden that bicycle for 6 years and had believed until that Friday night that it was luck. A woman of 74 named Constance Ide found the entry in the extras ledger that said tuition, 1 term, business college, do not tell the family, 1961, and she stood very still and said, "That was me," and then said it again, "That was me," and then had to be helped to a chair. Ada Farrell did not stay for all of it. She got cold around 8 and went inside and sat on a folding chair in the dark lobby by herself with the glow of the north window coming through the archway, and Ozzie found her there at 9 and sat down on the next chair, and neither of them said anything for a while. $2,750, Ozzie said eventually. It was a fair price, Ada said. Nobody else wanted it. On the 3rd of February, she recorded one more instrument. It was a deed of gift from Ada M. Farrell, unmarried, to the Vanderline Display Trust, an Ohio nonprofit corporation, conveying parcel 8-100 and 1421 together with all buildings. Improvements, fixtures, machinery, works of art, models, mechanisms, and other contents whatsoever, the same being intended to pass as one entire property and not in severalty, the 1911 language carried forward one more time, on purpose, by a woman who had spent 31 years learning exactly how much a sentence can do if nobody bothers to delete it. The trust's purposes, as stated in Article 2, are 3: to maintain the building, to set the north window every year from the day after Thanksgiving until the 6th of January, and to operate the 5th floor as a working shop in which persons under the age of 20 may be taught, without charge, the making of scenery, mechanisms, figures, and painted work. Article 4 fee reserves to the grantor a life tenancy in a 2-room apartment on the 3rd floor, which used to be the beauty parlor, and which she moved into that April at 75 years old because the house on Pearl Street was too much furnace for one person. She recorded the deed herself at the counter in the office where she had worked for 31 years. She paid the recording fee out of her purse. Darcy stamped it. "Do you want a certified copy, Mrs. Farrell?" "No, honey," Ada said. "It's in the book now. Somebody'll read it eventually."